In the last video, I finished cutting the recesses and the holes for the drivers and the baffles. So I'm done with those for now, but in between, I thought it might be interesting to take the drivers and put them in the baffle and run some measurements and see if I can come up with a better crossover. And this time, instead of doing it old school by swapping out the parts and running new measurements to see if I've made an improvement, I did it the modern way with a piece of computer software, the name of which I don't want to try to pronounce. And I can import the measurements, the individual measurements of the woofer and the tweeter without any crossover attached into this. And this will help me to design the crossover virtually without soldering and unsoldering any parts. I used this method before a couple years ago when I redesigned the crossover for the speakers that I built that I use in my office. And the results are very good. And it looks like I made a slight improvement here as well. Now, I don't have the capacitors that I need to build this crossover. I can parallel ones together to get roughly the value I need. But instead, I ordered some new ones and they should be here later this week. Like I said before, the base was originally going to be plywood that I was going to veneer with walnut veneer to make it nice and dark. I since changed my mind and went with cherry. I planed down a piece that I have right here to the right thickness, and hopefully it's the right length. I might have to adjust the length of my parts if it's not long enough, because I absolutely need everything out of this one. Now, I did draw it up in SketchUp, so I'm pretty close. So the first thing I need to do is get the two bases that I need, and the bases are the full width of the piece that I have here, and they're 9 inches long. Now, the thing about the base is that they slope on the front, so I can get two cut out of this piece with them slightly overlapping so that I can reduce how much of this I actually use. So the first thing I need to do is lay out that diagonal line on the cherry that I can then cut with the bandsaw. So that worked out pretty good. Next, I need to cut the parts that angle upwards on the back. And these are 8 3/4 inches long, and the cut on the bottom is 45 degrees. I'll be able to do that on my miter saw by tilting it over. And the cut on the top is at 41 degrees. Well, once again, these parts can nest together, so I can try to maximize what I'm getting out of this piece of wood. Now with those two cut, I can take the piece that's left over, which is actually more than long enough, and cut it down so it's a nice snug fit in those notches. And because I made the pockets rounded on the corners, I need to round over the corners on these. So I'm just going to do that on my little disc sander here, taking my time, making sure that I get an exact fit. Next thing I need to do is smooth out these bandsaw cuts that I made. I'm actually going to do that with the sander. But first I need to mark a line on here. This is the do not sand past this line. If I do sand past it, it's not that big of a deal, but I'm going to try not to. So I got the blocks clamped down on my workbench, and I'm using an 80 grit disc to begin with, and that'll do the major leveling. And then I'll switch to a 120 that will clean up the scratches from the coarser disc. And then I've got a sanding block here with 220 grit paper. I want to get this as smooth as I possibly can because it's going to be almost impossible to sand inside there after the parts are put together. While I was doing the sanding, I was wondering where I was going to put the crossover parts for these speakers, and I decided that the best thing to do is to cut a recess in the base right at the back. And I'm going to set up my adjustable router template so I can get that done using a 3/4 inch bit. That's probably deep enough, but I only want to do this once. So I'm going to change the bit again to that pattern following bit that I use for the pockets on the baffles and go just a 1/4 inch deeper. It's way easier to do it now than to try to take it apart after and do it then. Here's the problem with leaving just a very small amount at the end like that. It's pretty easy to break. I did this with the bit. But what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to route a recess for a bottom plate. That's going to be 1/4 inch thick steel. And that'll add weight to the base and also be a cover for the pocket where the crossover parts go. Now that I have the recesses done, I can cut the steel. And that'll be held in place by just 2 screws, one in each corner towards the front. I need to make more cuts on these uprights to taper them as they go from bottom to top. And I got the angles from the drawing that I made. I'm going to rotate the platter to 6 degrees, and I'm also going to tilt it to 9 degrees. But I need to make sure that this is right, so I'm going to make a test cut and repeat that until I get it just right. And as it turns out, it's just a little bit more than 6 degrees on the tilt too. The next step will be to put the stands together. But before I do that, I need to go back to the baffles and make a slot so that the wires will get up to the drivers. A better way to do this might be to use a long drill bit, as long as you can guide it straight. But I don't have one with me today, so I'm gonna route it out with a 5/16 inch bit, deep enough to get the 2 wires in that I need to go to both drivers. And then I can fill the outside with a strip of wood.